Hello everyone, and welcome back to the NPC Dungeon. I'm your host and game master for the time being, and today's episode is going to be the first of the secondary purpose I kind of mentioned for this podcast in the trailer, and that is storytelling. Me telling stories from campaigns I run in the past. After all, I am a storyteller. You're probably a storyteller, or you just like hearing stories, D&D stories, or tabletop RPG stories in particular. And if you're not interested in DM or GM advice, and you just want to hear a good story, hopefully a good, hopefully maybe funny story, you've come to the right place. So today's is definitely one of my favorites. It holds a special place in my heart because this is the combat that taught me how to really embody a villain or a monster or what have you, and what creature to better do that with than the terrifying and legendary bodak. So what happened? So if you don't know what a bodak is, don't worry. It's a monster from D&D. I played this in 3.5, and I'll get into that a little bit later once I start actually introducing this monster. But first, for a little bit of context. In my player's party, there were two rogues, one named Jack, and the other named Harold Bixby. Yeah, he was trying to come up with a name, and I made a joke by shouting the flashiest name I can think of, and he ran with it. Always a good idea to have a flashy name for a rogue. There was also a tiefling bard named Amoros the Amorous. That's probably one of my favorite names of any player whose character who's been in one of my campaigns. And lastly, a paladin blackguard named Thane. His whole bit was that he was brainwashed by an evil cult and had to hide his status from the other players. They were traveling through a swamp and after a few days came across a little island in the middle of a murky body of water that inhabited the very center of the swamp. On this island, there was a tall stone tower that, unbeknownst to my players, had once been the home/lab of a powerful necromancer named Ophisaurus, who had made it her entire life's mission to resurrect the monster resting beneath the very feet of everyone living on the island subcontinent that made up the setting for this campaign. Her foul practices had rendered the area a dead swamp, and after her death at the hands of an order of paladins, a cult had formed around her for the sole purpose of transporting her soul back to the material plane. This cult was, fun fact, actually the same cult to which Thane was beholden, and the main enemy of the campaign. The party had explored this tower and removed a smooth stone orb that they would soon find out was the key to bringing this evil necromancer back from the dead. However, after they did this, the tower spat them out, uprooted itself from the ground, and proceeded to attack the players. It was a literal tower boss. Yes, I just made that joke. And after a long and hard-fought battle, they bested the tower, and it crumbled to the ground. During the next session, Amoros was not present. He was communing with the being that had granted him the powers of a Shadow Dancer, which allowed him to manipulate darkness and jump between the shadows. So, Jack, Harold, and Thane made it their goal to leave the swamp. However, on the way, they decided to sift through some of the rubble and ended up finding a trapdoor. Player curiosity being what it is, they decided to delve down into the dungeon that lay under the tower of the Necromancer. And after solving a puzzle, accidentally summoning a demon, and sneaking past and then slaying, because why not, a sleeping digester, which, if you don't know, it's a creature that looks kind of like a velociraptor without any arms. It also has no real head per se, but instead shoots a corrosive acid out of its neck and dissolves its prey before picking up the remains with a long tube-like tongue. Gross, but very, very cool. The path on which they walked opened up into the middle of a wide-open cavern, where the floor and ceiling were too low and too high to be seen, even by the members of the party who had dark vision. But the path continued forward, stretching out as a bridge over the vast, empty chasm, suspended over the seemingly bottomless drop, and branching out into three more paths. One that continued forward, one that diverged to the right, and one that diverged to the left. The one that continued down the middle was blocked some distance down by a massive double door. This door seemed to be made up of 1,000 churning gears all stopped stuck in a standstill, and had two Small circular grooves carved out at about eye level to my players and submerged in the sea of cogs and dials, while Thane and Jack were figuring out that each path probably had the keys that went into these grooves and were beginning to scout out the two routes. Leave it up to the veritable wild card of this group, Harold Bigsby I mean, to stride up to the door, jam a bunch of explosive bullets he'd stolen for his slingshot from a little old woman earlier in the campaign, in the gaps between the gears, step out about 10 or 15 feet back, and then shoot a final bullet from a slingshot into the door. It creaked and groaned as the explosion dented the door and disintegrated the gears into a fine powder, leaving a gaping gap between the two sides as it hung slightly ajar. However, aside from just opening the door, bypassing my easy puzzle and shocking his companions, Thane and Jack, this explosion had also alerted the monsters on either side of them that guarded the two keys. From the right, they heard the crumbling of stone, and from the left, an unnatural whirling rush of wind. Thane stood firm and alone, facing down the path to the left, his ears tuned into the sound. He had a good idea of what was down there, and he refused any attempts from the other two to help. And it wasn't long before a flat, leathery creature, the shape and size of a stingray, or large, dark-colored cloak, sped in, flying in from the other side, humming a haunting moan. But Thane withstood it. He sheathed his blade at his side and knelt before the beast. His companions watched in horror as the monster reared back and swiped its tail down toward the hulking man, but he refused to budge, knowing neither fear nor regret as it swept past him and cut a deep gash into the ground beside him. Harold and Jack, however, had problems of their own as a wave of rock and dirt rolled in from the other side and took the form of a large earth elemental towering easily over the two of them. Their little game of whose fault is it would have to wait. It swung for Jack, knocking him to the ground as Harold crept around it, sinking his blade into its back. It turned on him as Jack pulled his bow from his side, notched an arrow, and loosed a shot at point-blank range into the elemental's shoulder. "We got this," said Harold, as he dodged another one of the monstrosity's attacks. He flaunted two metal gauntlets in his hands. He'd found them recently, but still, as Jack so loved to remind him, had not a clue what they did, though he could feel their mechanical gadgetry along their insides. "I wouldn't be so sure," Jack retorted as the creature cried out a gnarled scream of agony from nothing. Its rocky flesh drooped and turned molten as its limbs plopped to the ground one by one and its body melted before their eyes. Harold, fear lodged deep into his bones, peeked a trembling eye through the gap in the door and saw more treasure than he'd ever thought possible. His rogue's instincts were tingling as he laughed off his fear and turned back to see Jack sprinting around and hauling out of there. "What's the problem?" Harold asked, almost laughing. "Afraid?" "Yes," Jack shouted back at the top of his lungs, "and you should be too. Look again." Harold quizzically peeked back through the hole and into the treasure room, and immediately saw what struck terror into Jack's heart. Locking eyes with an almost featureless, gray humanoid, like a skeleton coated with liquid metal. Its tall, elongated head and still expressionless face nodded easily as it walked slowly from its throne in the back of the room, and its dark, sunken eye sockets housed little glaring lights that seemed to carve the word death into his very soul and shake him to his bones. But Harold shook off the effect that felt like an axe hovering over the back of his neck and fell to the floor. Crying, he rocked back and forth, pleading with the thing as Jack called him a baby and urged him to get up and run. "What about Thane?" Harold pleaded. "Leave the creepy dude, we gotta get out of here." But Thane was doing well for himself. He looked back up at the cloaker hovering above him and smirked. He stood, holding his hands out and waiting. But he already knew what would happen. He'd earned the respect of this incomprehensible creature, two minds warped by madness, and it swirled through the air and landed behind him on his shoulders, rippling as if in an imperceptible wind. Thane turned around to see the melted remains of the earth elemental, Harold Bigsby in tears rocking on the ground, and Jack booking it out the way they came. "What'd I miss?" By this time, the bodak had made its way to the door, shoved its hands through, and forced it the rest of the way open through sheer strength, and glared at the party before it. Immediately, Jack understood what Harold's terror was as he shrugged off the effect. Harold was still pleading at the being's feet, and Thane kept his composure, barely noticing the stirrings of death as they skipped through and past him. "Pick yourself up," he shouted mercilessly at Harold as he pulled a horn from his bag and held it to his lips. The notes that resounded from within its chamber seemed to materialize in the air in the form of 3 eagles. They rushed the bodak but dissolved in the air and fell as a molten mass of sludge and meat to the ground one by one. It returned its piercing gaze back down to Harold, who instinctively shut his eyes. The bodak kicked him to the side, forcing him to scramble for purchase as he rolled over and off the side of the bridge, just barely able to grapple on its stone surface. Jack looked up in horror. Self-preservation told him to leave, but he couldn't leave his party behind. Summoning the little magic he knew, he conjured up an ethereal hippogriff, a creature with the wings, head, and front legs of a giant eagle with the body of a horse. The creature charged the bodak, talons bared, but it ducked just in time and ground his foot into one of Harold's hands. Harold cried out in pain and pulled his hand back, only holding on by the one. The bodak lifted its other foot for a final stomp as Thane slashed his sword toward its sinewy torso. In a flash, it flung its arm back, grabbing his wrist, stopping him short, pushing him back, and it drove its foot into Thane's stomach and stared into his eyes. Thane felt the effect this time, and felt the first real fear he'd experienced in years, but he made it through and readied another attack. However, he'd already given Harold all the time he needed. If there was ever a time to try out his new accessory, it was now. He held his hand out toward the bodak and flexed his fingers in the gauntlet on his free hand, activating the mechanism inside. With a high-pitched whine and a thunderous boom, it flew off his hand and drove itself into the bodak's jaw before clattering back down past the bridge and lost into the darkness below. The bodak reeled back as he drove his now fumbling hand into his bag and pulled out an invisibility potion he stole from an alchemist in beginning this campaign. Harold downed it and hurled himself back onto the bridge, rolling behind the bodak before it had any time to notice. He swept up behind it, readied his dagger, but before he had time to pierce its flesh, it shot his gaze in his direction and extended his arm, snapping its hand around his throat. It picked up his dangling feet from the ground and stared into a foe it couldn't see. Harold stared helplessly back into its eyes, likely the one person, the only person in history to ever be able to lock eyes like this with the bodak, without its effect able to take hold as it swung him around, holding him over the edge. Jack shouted for his hippogriff to attack. It dove in, beak first, but was stopped dead in the air as the bodak stared down both it and Jack. It fell, melting in meaty chunks to the ground as Jack looked down at himself. His fingers drooped like liquid dripping from his hands, and it wasn't long before the rest of him followed, and he was reduced to a stinking puddle on the floor. The bodak dropped Harold over the edge and turned its sights on Thane, but Thane already had a plan. He was the last one left, and he wouldn't fall so easily. He held on tightly to his cloaker and flew forward, ramming into the monster. He grabbed him and held him over the edge, but he didn't have to drop him. They looked down and saw Harold Bigsby, now completely visible and holding on for dear life to an immovable rod, suspended in midair. The bodak saw its chance and broke free from the grapple, tackling Harold and trying to take him down with him, but he held on fast as Thane leapt from his cloaker and tackled the bodak. "You'd better hold on," he shouted to Harold as he latched onto the torso and grasped for his arms. But this was good enough for the bodak. It released its grip on Harold, dropping both it and Thane down into the abyss. As they plummeted, the cloaker swooped down and Thane grabbed on, but so did the bodak. It pulled itself up and stared into the cloaker's eyes, but it stared confidently back and shook it. It reached over to swipe at Thane, but he refused to die now. He swung himself out of the way and swung for the bodak. They kicked and thrashed and shook at each other. The cloaker ran the bodak into one of the walls, but nothing worked as Harold watched on in helpless horror. He scrambled up the rod and sat, weighing his options. Then he looked down at the remaining gauntlet covering his hand and aimed it for the bodak. He activated the triggering mechanism inside, and it flew off his hand through the air and into the back of its head. It locked eyes with Thane, and he was certain the end was near, but the little gauntlet knocked its gaze from the man and sent its head lurching forward. "Now's your chance," shouted Harold. Thane grabbed it by its head and pulled it off the cloaker before throwing it down into the abyss, after the gauntlet that had sunk down into the depths after its twin. He donned his cloaker once more, picked up Harold and the immovable rod, and turned to the bridge where they silently passed into the treasure room. Harold, the potion nabbing, gauntlet snatching, and immovable rod stealing rogue that he was, if all people didn't even feel like stealing or looting now. He stared sadly out the way they came until he felt a tap on his shoulder. He turned around to see Thane holding an empty golden urn and a solemn nod. "For Jack," he said. Harold nodded. "For Jack." Together, they filled the urn with his remains and placed it on the throne before departing through a door on the other side of the treasure room and continuing on the next leg of their adventure. So that was an intense one. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you'll join me next time where I'll be sharing more GM advice. But until then, and as always, I just learned something.